Hey there, I'm Alicia. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about my favorite science fiction and fantasy books that I read in 2021. I'm going to give you my top 3 in each genre, 3 science fiction books and 3 fantasy books. So without any further ado, let's get right into the video. So why don't we do one and one? We'll talk about sci-fi and then fantasy and vice versa. So why don't we go ahead and kick it off with fantasy. The first book on this list is The Fall of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson, and this is the second book in the Mistborn trilogy. I did end up completing Mistborn Era 1 this year. I actually have a dedicated review to the entire trilogy, so I will go ahead and link it in case you do want to watch it. This was by far my favorite book in the trilogy, and I know this is an unpopular opinion because people think that this suffers from the second book syndrome and that it's really slow and it really drags, but I disagree. I don't think it drags. Yes, it is slower than the other books, but there is so much character growth and development. We also get a lot more from the side characters. There's also a lot of political machinations, which is something that I really enjoy in my fantasy. So overall, I just love The Fall of Ascension. It's my favorite book in the trilogy, believe it or not. But hey, I just think that this book deserves more love, so here it is. So moving over into the sci-fi genre, the next book on this list is Kindred by Octavia Butler, and this is a time-traveling science fiction book with a big emphasis on its thematic elements. And so in Kindred, we are following a Black woman living in the 1970s in California. Her name is Dana, and all of a sudden, she is yanked back in time to the antebellum South in Maryland sometime in the 1800s. She's pulled back to save this little white boy named Rufus, and from here we see Dana trying to navigate this scenario that she's been placed in with no control, and see her get pulled in time back in time again to save this little boy as he's growing up. It's a super creative book, really engaging. Right from page 1, I was immediately engrossed. It was a book that I couldn't put down, that I had to keep reading, but it's also one that can be emotionally challenging just because of the subject matter. She is pulled back in time to slavery days in the United States, and we get to see how inescapable and how pervasive the systems of oppression are around her. And as someone from the future and having some historical knowledge, whenever she goes back in time, she tries to apply that to see if there could be a different result. Is there? I don't know. You'll have to read it to find out. Moving back to fantasy, the next book on this list is The Inheritance of Orivia Divina. This is by Zoraida Cordova, and this is just such a beautiful book, and it was just such a pleasure to read. I'm usually not someone that is drawn to very cozy and beautiful and fantastical books, but this one is one that just took my heart completely. I love the family dynamics in the book. I loved the fantastical elements. I love that we had a wide cast of characters. It was just everything that I didn't know that I needed. If you're someone who loves the found family trope, I think that you'll really love this book. The Montoya family is definitely a family that I would love to be a part of. And in this one, we are following primarily Marimar and Rey. They have been called back to their grandma's house. She is dying, and she basically tells her whole family to come claim their inheritance. And when she gets there, she turns into a tree. Now, all of them receive this gift from their grandmother, but years later, it seems like someone is watching them and is out to get them. And so they have to go on a hunt and dig up past family secrets. It's full of adventure and magic. It was just such a great and fun book to read. Moving back to sci-fi, the next book on this list is Lakewood by Megan Giddens. And I debated whether to put this book on this particular list because even though it does have sci-fi elements, it does lean more towards speculative fiction. It has elements from the sci-fi, the thriller, the horror genre, as well as history. Before I picked it up, someone described this to me as a mix of The Life of Henrietta Lacks and part Handmaid's Tale. I can definitely see the comparison with The Life of Henrietta Lacks, but I think it's more of a Get Out meets The Life of Henrietta Lacks, in my opinion. This is a speculative fiction novel that really analyzes class and race and really sheds light to the years of experimentation on Black bodies. It's a very creative and thought-provoking book, and I think what I loved the most about it, Megan Giddens doesn't handhold you through everything that she's telling you. It's a very compelling story on its own, and it's well written, it's atmospheric, and it's a little bit creepy, but she sprinkles moral dilemmas on top of this story that really just makes you think and analyze in the context that it's placed in. It's one that I thought about weeks after reading it. It's one that I still think about to this day. I think it's a very important book to read that is rooted in historical context. But that being said, it's also a fun thriller horror, speculative fiction, sci-fi book that was very creepy and atmospheric. So just to tell you what it is about, we are following Lena, and Lena's grandmother has recently died, so she decides to drop out from college because her family is left with a lot of debt and she needs to help them out. And she's recruited to participate in the study that is very sus. They make her sign an NDA. They tell her she can't tell anyone that this is happening, and they ask her to relocate to this new city, and basically they start to experiment on her, and all of this weird stuff happens, and some parts of it feel like a fever dream. So it's one that's also very creative in its narrative style. If you're someone who likes very straightforward books or very linear books, or just books that really just tell you what the message is, I don't think that you'll really enjoy this one because it can be a little bit confusing. It is one that will let you draw your own conclusions, but I also think that it's one that was very expertly done. I do believe this was also her debut, which I think is fantastic for a debut. Now going back to fantasy, this is my favorite fantasy book of the year, and that is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. And this was just such a charming and such a creative and fun book to read. It's one that when you start, you're just completely lost. You're like, what's going on? But Susanna Clarke just does such a wonderful job at creating intrigue and really peeling back the layers to reveal the core of the story. And so in this one, we're following Piranesi, who lives in a house that is not like other houses. This house has quite a lot of rooms, and there are statues in it, and the ocean comes in and floods the bottom layer of this house. So it's just this very, very big house, and parts of it remain unexplored. There is another character here called the Other, and the Other recruits Piranesi to find things around the house and to study this great knowledge. They think that they can find it within the house. And as Piranesi is going about trying to gather information, there's some evidence that there might be another person in the house. And from there, the story really takes off. I can't really tell you much more. This is one of those books that you'll either love or hate, and it's one that I can't recommend to everybody, but it does have those elements that I personally really love in books that are very intriguing, books that sort of feel like a puzzle that you have to put together, where the author doesn't handhold you and they really let you draw your own conclusions. So if you're someone who, again, likes very straightforward books, this is not that book, but it's one that I just implore you to check out and see if you'll like it, because if you like it, you'll really like it. But unfortunately, if you don't like it, you'll probably hate it. So going back to science fiction, this is going to be my favorite science fiction book of 2021, and that is The Vanished Birds by Simone Jimenez. And this is also a debut, which I just couldn't believe because it's extremely well written. It's very emotive, and the prose was just delectable. The strengths for this book for me were definitely the beautiful prose in the writing, but also the character dynamics. The characters in here were really strong. We follow quite a large cast of characters, so if that is something that you're looking for in your books, this is one that has it. It's also a book that spans a millennium, so it can get a little bit confusing. This is definitely a character-driven book, and the pace leans on the slower side for the majority of the book until you get to the end. If you're someone that likes Becky Chambers' works, but you find them a little bit too fluffy or too good-natured and you want something that's a little bit more gritty, this is one that I think you'll really love. I don't really want to give you a synopsis because I feel like it's part of the adventure to just sort of go into this book knowing as very little as possible, similarly to Piranesi. So what I can tell you so that you're not confused is that Vanished Birds feels like an album, if that makes sense. So there's a bunch of short stories in the book that you can equate to a song in an album, and then The Vanished Birds as a whole is the album. But all of these short stories are really cohesive and they really move the plot forward. And the reason that I want to mention this is because after reading the first chapter, I thought that the characters that were introduced were going to be our main characters, but that's not the case. He starts off the book with a short story, and so I just found that really interesting, very creative, very unique, but it really worked for me. I recently put out my most disappointing books of 2021, and The Starless Sea was on there, and like I said, I really liked The Starless Sea, but in my opinion, The Vanished Birds succeeded in doing what The Starless Sea didn't. So those were my favorite fantasy and sci-fi books of 2021. So if you made it this far, let me know down below what your favorite sci-fi and fantasy books were. Were any of them on this list? If you like my channel, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring that notification bell. It would mean a lot to me. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Bye!
Sigo cruzando ríos, hundiendo selvas, hundiendo sol. Cada día sigo sacando espinas de lo profundo del corazón. En la noche sigo encendiendo sueños para limpiar con el humo sagrado cada recuerdo. Cuando escribo tu nombre en la arena blanca con fondo azul, cuando miro el cielo una forma cruel, una nube que se parezcas tú, una tarde subo una alta aroma, ver el pasado sabrás que no te he olvidado. Yo te llevo dentro hasta la raíz, y por más que crezca vas a estar aquí. Aunque yo me oculte tras la montaña y encuentro campo lleno de caña, no habrá manera, mi rayo de luna, que tú te vayas. Pienso que cada instante he sobrevivido al caminar, y cada segundo de ser el hombre, cada momento de no saber ser la clave exacta de este tejido, no cargando bajo la piel, así te protejo. Aquí sigues dentro, yo te llevo dentro hasta la raíz, y por más que crezca vas a estar aquí. Aunque yo me oculte tras la montaña y no encuentro un campo lleno de caña, no habrá manera, mi rayo de luna, que tú te vayas, que tú te vayas. Yo te llevo dentro hasta la raíz, y por más que crezca vas a estar aquí. Aunque yo me oculte tras la montaña y no encuentro un campo lleno de caña, no habrá manera, mi rayo de luna, que tú te vayas, que tú te vayas. Yo te llevo dentro hasta la raíz, y por más que crezca vas a estar aquí. Aunque yo me oculte tras la montaña y no encuentro un campo lleno de caña, no habrá manera, mi rayo de luna, que tú te vayas.